Proverbs 22:3 says that the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. And today, on February 16th, 2026, we are standing at the absolute precipice of a danger that has been engineered for decades to catch the world in a state of total spiritual and financial slumber. As I look at the data flowing through the global markets, and I cross-reference it with the prophetic patterns found in the Word of God, I see a collision course that terminates in March of this year. And I want you to understand that I am not here to give you a market report or a generic financial update, because we are past the point of minor corrections, and we are now entering the season of the great systemic reset, where the rules of the game are being changed while you sleep. If you remember our deep dive into the debt trap, you know that the modern banking system was never meant to be a service, but a harvest tool designed to reap the labor of the believer and consolidate it into the hands of a few central architects who do not share your values or your faith. And as we move into these final weeks of February, the pressure in the credit markets is reaching a breaking point that suggests a massive liquidity event is scheduled for next month, which will leave those who are still walking in the simple path of the world completely exposed to the elements of a collapsing currency and a rising digital control grid that will demand your total submission in exchange for access to your own wealth. You see, the prudent man does not wait for the news anchor to tell him that the house is on fire, because by then the exits are already blocked, and the cost of escape is your entire inheritance. So we must act with a sense of holy urgency that overrides our desire for comfort and our fear of looking different from our neighbors, who are still laughing and eating and drinking, while the floodwaters of debt are already at their doorsteps. And I am calling every steward listening to this message to stop viewing your bank account as a safe haven and start seeing it as a battlefield where your legacy and your ability to provide for your family are being contested by powers that want to see the church silenced and the family unit broken through the weight of financial desperation, because a man who owes everything to Caesar is a man who finds it very difficult to give everything to God. And that is the true objective of the debt trap that we are exposing today, as we prepare for the March window where the digital gates will begin to swing shut on the unprepared. And the only way to avoid the penalty mentioned in Proverbs is to take refuge now, by decoupling your soul and your resources from the Babylonian structure that is currently shaking to its core before the final transition begins, and you find yourself trapped in a system that no longer recognizes your autonomy or your rights as a child of the King. So let this be the wake-up call that shakes you out of the lethargy of 2025 and into the active stewardship required for 2026, because the Messiah is speaking, and his instructions are clear for those who have ears to hear and the courage to move their hands accordingly. And we must realize that the stability we once took for granted was merely a facade, designed to keep us compliant while the foundations were being eroded by the very people who promised to protect them. And now that the erosion is complete, the collapse is no longer a matter of if, but a matter of when. And according to every indicator we have left, the clock is ticking down to a moment of truth that will separate the houses built on sand from the houses built on the rock of biblical wisdom. So do not be deceived by the temporary calm that precedes the storm, because that calm is the silence of a trap being set for the masses who refuse to look up and see the signs in the sun and the moon and the financial stars that are all pointing toward a day of reckoning that will change the face of human commerce forever. And your role in this hour is not to be a victim of the reset, but to be a manager of the kingdom assets entrusted to you. Because if you are found faithful in this little time of testing, you will be given authority over much when the new era begins. But first you must survive the snare of the fowler and the deadly pestilence of the debt economy that is currently suffocating the global church. and preventing us from fulfilling the Great Commission with the boldness that only financial liberty can provide. So listen closely as we move into the specific steps that you must take before the calendar turns to March, and the opportunity for easy exit vanishes into the fog of a national emergency and a forced digital transition that will leave the simple man begging for crumbs, while the prudent man stands in a position of strength and provision for his family and his community. Asterisk, the first major move you must execute in this final window of opportunity is the purification of your liquidity, because we have entered an era where having numbers on a digital screen does not equate to having real resources in your hand. And the greatest deception of the current age is the illusion of digital ownership that can be erased with a single keystroke from a central authority that does not know your name and does not care about your survival. As we approach the March deadline, the risk of bank bail-ins, where the institution literally seizes your deposits to cover its own insolvency, is no longer a theoretical risk found in hidden textbooks, but a legal reality that has been integrated into the banking laws of almost every major nation. While the public was distracted by entertainment and trivial political conflicts, and you must ask yourself the most basic question of survival, which is simply this: if the banking servers were to go offline for a week, or if your access to your funds was restricted based on your beliefs or your spending habits, would you still be able to feed your family and fulfill your biblical mandate as a provider? Because if the answer is no, then you are not a steward, you are a dependent, and you have allowed your family's lifeblood to be stored in a silo that you do not control. And this is why we must look at the pattern of Joseph, who was chosen by God to save the world from a famine that would have destroyed the line of Israel if he had not possessed the wisdom to build physical storehouses filled with tangible assets like grain and food and silver. Because Joseph knew that in a time of systemic collapse, a promise from the government is worth nothing, but a bag of grain is worth everything. And your mission in these coming weeks is to establish your own personal storehouse by moving your emergency seeds out of high-risk digital accounts and into assets that carry intrinsic value, that no politician can devalue and no bank can freeze. And this means diversifying into physical silver and gold, which have been the recognized currency of the kingdom for thousands of years, and which remain the only form of money that does not require a third party's permission to spend or to trade, as well as securing a physical reserve of essential goods. That will become the new currency of exchange if the supply chains continue to fail under the weight of the debt bubble, because you cannot eat a debit card and you cannot pay your tithe with a locked account. So you must decouple your operational capital from the grid and place it where it can be reached in 24 hours or less, without an application or an approval process from a system that is currently dying under its own weight. And I want you to understand that this is not about fear, but about the highest level of biblical prudence, because the borrower is slave to the lender, but the man with a full storehouse is a leader in the gate. And God is searching for men and women who have the discernment to see that the era of blind trust in the financial system is over, and the era of tangible stewardship has returned. So do not let your resources be trapped in the belly of the beast during the Great Reset of March 2026, but bring them into the light of your own direct management, where they can be used to advance the kingdom and provide a refuge for the weak when the storm finally breaks in full force. Step 2 in this critical timeline is the aggressive decoupling from the debt slavery that has kept the body of Christ in a state of financial paralysis for far too long. Because you cannot serve two masters and you cannot be a bold witness for the Messiah while you are constantly looking over your shoulder at a growing mountain of interest that is designed to consume your future before you even have a chance to live it. And as we analyze the trajectory of interest rates for this first quarter of 2026, it is clear that the lenders are preparing to tighten. The screws on every variable rate contract in existence in order to extract the last remaining drops of wealth from the middle class before the system undergoes its final transformation into a social credit model where your debts will be used as leverage to dictate your behavior and your speech and even your ability to buy and sell in the marketplace. So you must view your debt not as a financial convenience or a tool of leverage, but as a spiritual chain that is tethering you to a sinking ship. And you must attack those chains with a sense of holy violence that subordinates every other desire for luxury to the goal of total liberty. And this means understanding the mechanics of how the enemy uses compounding interest to steal the tithe and the offering from the house of God before it even reaches your hands. Because when you are paying 20 or 30% interest on a credit card, you are essentially funding the kingdom of darkness with the resources that were meant to expand the kingdom of light. So you must use what I call the prophetic snowball method to kill your smallest debts immediately while the currency still has some semblance of purchasing power. Because as inflation accelerates and the reset begins, the cost of servicing that debt will become a weight that will drown even the most well-meaning Christian families who thought they could manage the payments forever. But the window for management is over, and the window for escape is closing fast. So you need to redirect every extra cent from your entertainment and your subscriptions and your unnecessary luxuries and apply it directly to the principal of your debts. And I want you to look at your life and find every hidden leak where your seed is being drained by companies that hate your values. Because every dollar you save from a subscription is a dollar you can use to buy your freedom back from the bank. And you must realize that being debt-free is not just a financial goal, but a strategic military position in the spirit. Because the man who owes nothing is the only man who can truly say no to the mark of the system and the demands of the world. And as we head into this March shift, where those who are unencumbered will be the only ones with the mobility to move their families to safety, or to invest in the kingdom opportunities that always arise during a great systemic transition, you must be ready to walk away from everything that is holding you back. And do not be deceived by the low monthly payment trap, because it is the bait that leads to the cage. And once the cage door is locked in March, the keys will be held by institutions that do not recognize the authority of the Word of God. And you will find yourself working to build someone else's empire while your own children's inheritance is consumed by interest. And you must remember that the borrower's slave to the lender is not a suggestion, but a spiritual law that governs the flow of power in this world. So if you want to have power to bless your children and your grandchildren, you must break the power of the lender over your household today. And this requires a radical shift in your lifestyle where you stop buying things you don't need with money. You don't have to impress people you don't like. And instead you start building a fortress of freedom that the enemy cannot penetrate. Because when the reset happens and the credit markets freeze, the man with zero debt will be the king of his own domain, while the man with $1 million in debt and $1 million in assets will find himself at the mercy of a bank that wants to seize his collateral. So do not play the game of the world any longer, and do not trust in the stability of your credit score, because that score is a measure of how well you serve the beast system. And God is calling you to a different score, a score of faithfulness and obedience to His word, which says to owe no man anything but the debt of love. And as you begin this process of aggressive decoupling, you will feel a weight lifting off your spirit that you didn't even know was there. Because debt is a spiritual burden that clouds your vision and dampens your faith. And once that weight is gone, you will hear the voice of the Spirit with a clarity that will guide you through the dark days ahead with perfect peace and total confidence in the provision of the Messiah. Asterisk. Step 3 is the implementation of the Joseph Mandate, which is the heart and soul of why Messiah Speaks exists in this hour. Because we do not prepare to hide in a bunker or to hoard resources out of a spirit of fear, We prepare to provide and to lead in a world that will have no answers when the debt trap finally snaps shut. And you must understand the distinction between a hoarder and a steward. Because a hoarder is driven by the fear of lack, while a steward is driven by the love of his neighbor and the command of his king. And as the global systems continue to fracture and the supply chains become more brittle than ever before, the Joseph Mandate becomes our strategic blueprint for survival and ministry. Because God is looking for men and women who have the courage to decrease their own consumption, now so that they can increase their capacity to bless others when the famine hits in full force. And the world prepares out of a scarcity mindset, but the believer prepares out of an abundance mindset, knowing that our Father provides enough for us to be a blessing even in the midst of a desert. And the Joseph Mandate is about becoming a pillar of stability in a crumbling community so that when the financial systems fail in March of 2026, the people around you who laughed at your warnings will see the peace in your eyes and the bread in your hands, and they will ask you for the hope that lies within you. And that is the moment where the greatest harvest of souls will occur. Because you cannot preach the gospel of a providing God if you are standing in the same breadline as the unbelievers. So you must prepare your household now so that you can be the one to feed your community when the systemic famine hits. And this means having an overflow of wisdom and an overflow of resources and an overflow of spiritual peace that can only come from knowing you have been a faithful steward of the warnings you received. And I want you to imagine the impact of a church that is actually prepared to take care of its own widows and orphans without asking for a government grant or a bank loan. Because that is the kind of sovereignty that the early church had, and that is the kind of sovereignty we must recover if we are to survive the transition into the new era. And you must realize that true financial security is not found in the size of your portfolio, but in the strength of your covenant with the Creator, who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And when everyone else is panicking because their digital wallets are empty, or their accounts are frozen due to a system error or a social credit violation, you will be the one standing on the rock with your storehouse ready to serve the least of these. And this is why we store up grain, and we store up silver, and we store up medical supplies, and we store up biblical knowledge, not to survive the famine for ourselves, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus during the most difficult transition in human history. Because your stewardship today is directly tied to the souls that will be saved tomorrow through your generosity and your foresight. And the time of the lone survivor is over, because the time of the community provider has begun. And you must begin to network with other like-minded believers in your local area to build systems of exchange and support that do not rely on the beast system. Because as we move closer to the March deadline, the ability to operate outside of the centralized digital grid will be the difference between freedom and forced compliance. So do not let your heart be troubled by the news, but let your hands be busy with the work of preparation. Because God is looking for Josephs who are willing to use their positions and their resources to preserve a remnant in the earth. And as you step into this mandate, you will find that God provides the means for the mission. And you will see miracles of multiplication and miracles of provision that the world will not be able to explain. Because our God is Jireh, and He is not limited by the inflation or the deflation or the resets of man-made economies. So stand tall and fill your storehouse with the expectation that you are being positioned for the greatest move of God the world has ever seen. We have reached the end of this warning, and the information has been given, and the scriptures have been opened, and the signs in the world are now undeniable to anyone who is willing to look with spiritual eyes. And now the burden of action is on you, because the Messiah speaks through His word and through the discernment He gives His people, but only the obedient will see the fruit of protection in the coming months. And I want you to realize that this is not just another video in your feed to be watched and forgotten while you move on to the next distraction. It is a divine appointment to change the trajectory of your household and your legacy before the March reset changes everything for everyone on this planet. And the choice you make today will resonate through your family tree for generations to come. Because either you will be the one who led your family to safety, or you will be the one who allowed them to be swept away by a flood of debt and digital control that was clearly predicted and clearly warned against. So go to the description below and use the resources I've provided to start these 3 moves today, and do not let the spirit of procrastination steal the window of grace that you have been given. Because procrastination is just a polite word for disobedience when God has given a clear command to move. And you must go back and study the debt trap video if you need to understand the spiritual architecture behind this fight, so that you can stand firm when the pressure increases. But whatever you do, do not stay still, because the prudent see the danger and take refuge, while the simple keep going and pay the penalty. And my prayer for you today is that you would be found among the prudent, and that you would be ready and prepared and at peace when the rest of the world is in chaos and fear. And I want you to remember that the same God who led the people of Israel through the wilderness with a pillar of fire is the same God who is leading you today through the financial wilderness of 2026. And he has not lost his power, and he has not forgotten his promises to those who walk in his ways. So stay vigilant and keep your eyes on the King, and remember that the choice you make this week will determine the testimony you have next year when the system has fallen and only the kingdom remains standing. And I am calling you to be a voice of hope and a voice of truth in a world of lies, and to show the power of biblical stewardship to a generation that has lost its way. Because this is the hour where the light of the church must shine the brightest against the backdrop of a dark and failing economy. And I believe that you were born for such a time as this, to be a light and a provider and a witness of the goodness of God in the land of the living. So take heart and take action, and do not be afraid of what is coming, because you belong to the one who has already overcome the world and all its systems. And as you move forward in faith, you will see the hand of God moving before you to open doors that no man can shut, and to provide resources that the world cannot understand. Stay strong and stay free in the name of the Messiah, and remember that we are more than strangers in this world. We are the ambassadors of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Stay tuned for the next update, and keep sharing the truth with those who have ears to hear. This is Messiah Speaks, and I will see you in the storehouse of the faithful.